David personally for getting on and making himself available for this important webinar. I think he's going to provide some really important information. A little bit about myself. I'm the Vice President of Operations for Fundamental Labor Strategies. I've been with Fundamental a little under 20 years. And if anybody wants to, and on the webinar wants to know anything more about Fundamental or how we can help your operation succeed with drivers and with DOT compliance help, please feel free to reach out to me. I'm going to be fielding questions through the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom meeting. So if you have questions, you can type them into the Q&A section. I'll keep track of those questions, and we'll wait till the end, and I'll present those to David so he can answer them. David also has been sent a list of pre-sent questions, and if he doesn't address them in the seminar, he will get to those at the end also. All right. Thanks everybody for joining, and I'm going to hand it over to David at this point.
Yep. I'll do a quick intro. Now we're going to get to the main event. About a year and a half ago, I think in the industry, we started to hear lots of chatter about the Drug and Alcohol Clearinghouse. Who will our users be? Will the drivers sign up? Are we going to be compliant? What's it going to do to our driver supply? And now we've kind of had a year and a half roll by, and we thought it's still a hot topic. And I think we're all interested in hearing how that went and where we think it's going. So we reached out to David, who's been a long-term partner of ours and obviously knows everything. He is one of the people that created the Drug and Alcohol Clearinghouse and has been responsible for getting it up and running. So let me turn it over to David.
Okay. Good morning, everyone, and thank you, Cinda and the Fundamental team for inviting me. As Cinda mentioned, I think we were going to try to do this last April in person, but as COVID kind of struck the nation, that kind of pushed that off. So I'm actually happy to be here. It's a refreshing presentation we're going to be doing. We've spent so much time, over the course of the last year, talking so much about what the requirements are for the clearinghouse, what people need to do, that having a conversation a year into it about what we're seeing is actually something a little different. So hopefully you'll get some good stuff out of this. I'm here to answer questions. As Cinda said, I started talking at Fundamentals seminars on various topics. Seems like a very long time ago that I started with them. I worked in New Jersey for about 23 years in the local division, and then transitioned to our Washington, D.C. Headquarters office, where I'm currently the chief of the compliance division, which, as Cinda mentioned, we were responsible for the implementation of the Drug and Alcohol Clearinghouse, and also we have currently the responsibility for the drug and alcohol program as well as some other topics that maybe we can touch on in other seminars in the future. But with that, let's get started. The seminar is entitled, the first year in the rearview mirror, and I think that's an appropriate title because I think back in January of 2020, when we implemented the clearinghouse, we really didn't know what we would see over the course of the 12 months after that. And now that we've come to over the 1 year mark, we've started to see a lot of good information come in, some things that we didn't expect, of course, as usual, but we'll be touching on some of those topics today. So as a reminder, the clearinghouse was implemented in January 6, 2020. I kind of want to just touch base real quick as to what the clearinghouse is. And basically, the clearinghouse is a repository for motor carriers and medical review officers to report drug and alcohol violations, and predominantly for motor carriers, a place where they can query their drivers to determine if there are any existing violations. Something it's not, and again, this is kind of just one of those refresher topics. It's not something that fundamentally changed the way we do drug and alcohol testing. We've had a lot of questions come in about, certain aspects of the drug and alcohol testing program in Part 382 or Part 40. And the clearinghouse really didn't change all that much as it relates to having to do a pre-employment test, having to do a random test, post-accident testing. But as with anything, once you start gathering information into a central location, you start having a repository of violations, you start to see things appear that I firmly believe existed prior to the clearinghouse. But now the clearinghouse shines a light on things, they suddenly become bigger issues. And, these are some of the things that we will discuss a little later in the presentation. Another thing it's not, and this is a common question we get sometimes, is it's not a place where an employer would go to enter their drivers into a database. When an employer goes into the clearinghouse, they're basically going into either report a violation where they'll need their driver's information to do that, or they're going in to run a query where, again, they'll need their driver's information to do that. Some questions we get is, I'm at the clearinghouse, where do I enter all my drivers? And the answer to that question is you don't. We're not matching individual drivers to companies. The only time you're going to enter driver information into the clearinghouse is when you're going to do a query or report a violation. So that's basically what it is and what it isn't. One thing I also want to touch on is, what we refer to as sort of the DACH 2 rulemaking. And that was issued as a proposed rulemaking in April 2020. We did get our comments back, and we're currently going through those comments before we issue a final rule. But basically, one of the things that we ran into with the first clearinghouse rule is that there was some lack of clarity as it related to how the clearinghouse would impact a state driver's license agency and what they would or would not do with a driver's CDL as they interact with the clearinghouse. So when the clearinghouse was rolled out in 2020, all the requirements that were imposed on employers or MROs and SAPs, that was all kept in place. But the component that related to what would happen to a driver's actual CDL based on a violation reported to the clearinghouse, that was put on hold until we could get some clarification in this next rulemaking. And I think that's going to be an important piece down the road when and if it becomes a final rule, because I think that's going to help employers, identify drivers with issues, not only, by running them through the clearinghouse, but, we'll also start seeing potentially some downgrading of licenses based on violations that are reported. And you'll have another method for obtaining that information. So just kind of keep your eyes out for that one. When that'll be published is anybody's guess, but it is something that, we'll be looking forward as a future enhancement to the Drug and Alcohol Clearinghouse. So what have we seen? I think one of the early questions that came in that Jeff mentioned, someone asked, well, okay, here's what we've seen so far. What do you think we're going to see in the next year? And granted, this year was a little different than most years because of the issues with COVID. But we did see an industry that, even while things were shutting down, the trucking industry primarily, they kept rolling, because as being essential to getting the goods and supplies to people, one of the things we recognize is that, trucking could not stop. So things continued for most of our industry. And I think what we saw from a testing perspective and a reporting perspective, we didn't really see that much of a drop off when it came to the truck industry. Passenger carrier is a little different. That industry, because they were more service-based and dealing with customers, we did see a big drop off there. But, we are predominantly populated with trucking companies in our census base. So, those numbers kind of held up. And what we've seen, and the numbers you're seeing today are based on our most recent published report. It may or may not even be on there today. These numbers, like I said, were fresh, hot off the presses as of yesterday, and the report was being finalized to be posted. So you may be getting an early peek before anybody else. But these are where we're at as of the end of March 2021. We've had over 2 million people register in the clearinghouse. The majority of those are CDL drivers. That 1.8, almost 1.9 million drivers have actually registered for an account in the clearinghouse, which is good. It enables them to respond to consent queries, in a timely fashion, keep an eye on their data. One of the things that we are definitely conscious of is that information could still filter into the clearinghouse and get onto a driver's record. And if it needs to come off because it was a mistake, the sooner a driver's notified via email versus waiting for a letter to come in the mail is a very important thing. So encouraging your drivers to register is something that you would, definitely want to push. It'll help you if you've got to run a full query, but it'll also help them protect themselves if something does flow in that isn't, that shouldn't be there. From an employer standpoint, you see that number, 227,000 employers have registered. I mean, that's a good number, but it's not, probably close to where we need to be from an employer standpoint. And what number that is anybody's guess. We kind of throw out the number of there's about 600,000 active carriers in our database, but not all of them would be subject to drug and alcohol testing. But I think, definitely 227 is probably lower than we'd like to see. But I don't think 600,000 is where we're going to end up. With that said, the real question mark for us going into the clearinghouse, and still is today, which employers will be registering that we previously didn't know about. And those are your governmental entities, your school districts, entities that aren't required to have a DOT number, but are still subject to CDL and drug and alcohol testing. Those are the ones that would have to register for clearinghouse and actually engage and use the clearinghouse. That number that I throw up there is like, the 600,000 employers, but you understand that, probably over 90% of those 600,000 have 10 or fewer vehicles. And that's an important point to remember when we start talking about how many queries have been done. Because, when you look at, where my queries go? Uh-oh, sorry guys. Did I miss a slide? That's on me, guys. Sorry about that. I did have a slide on queries, so I apologize.
David, we can still just see your first panel,
which is the
Drug and Alcohol Clearinghouse title page.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm not sharing the right screen then. Uh-oh, hold on. Sorry about that. Technical difficulties. This is why we try to do this live. So you're not seeing my presentation.
We can see the first page of your presentation.
And why is it moving on my screen? Okay. Hold on. Sorry for that, folks. We're going to try this again. Thought we had this worked out in our pre.
Okay. Right now you're screen sharing and we can see the side slides. There we go.
But it's not moving.
No, it is now. So now you're at the first page. Now we're at the second. That's good. Full screen. It's perfect. Okay.
Sorry about that. Okay, so this was the registration numbers that we were talking about. Thank you for pointing out that it wasn't advancing. But one of the things I'll point out from a query perspective, and like I said, I unfortunately don't know what happened to the slide I had on that. It seems to have disappeared. But from a numbers perspective, we've had almost to date nearly 6 million queries that have been run on drivers by employers. If you looked at those numbers, if you split them out from a pre-employment perspective and a limited query perspective, you're talking about almost a 45% split, which is good. One of the things that we expected the first year is that, leading up to that 1 year anniversary mark, we would see a lot of pre-employment queries being done. And again, with COVID, obviously there was some impacts on that, but towards the end of summer, we started to see those numbers pick up considerably as things started to ramp back up, and they have held steady from a pre-employment query standpoint. And then right around November, December, January, we saw that expected spike of limited queries being run by employers as they started to get to that 1 year mark of implementation of the clearinghouse. And then as obviously once all those were run, we started to see the limited queries tail off, but then the pre-employment queries continue. To a certain very much smaller percentage of queries that are being run are the full non-pre-employment queries. And again, those are done primarily by mistake, or if the results of a limited query come back with information that there is information available, then the employer is required to run that full query within 24 hours and get those results back before having to pull a driver from their safety sensitive functions. Now I mentioned, that while we only have 227,000 employers registered, we throw around a number of, 4.6 million CDL drivers in the country. Obviously not all of them are working. Some are just CDL holders, but they don't utilize them. When we look at our query numbers, what we have seen is that somewhere in the neighborhood of about 3.5 million individual CDL holders have had queries run on them. So, even though we don't have a full coverage from an employer perspective, the employers that we do have registered are accounting for, quite a number of individual CDL drivers. So what we're seeing is that, we are getting a good number of CDL drivers that are being queried in the clearinghouse, as opposed to the number of employers that are registered. So we are getting some good coverage, and with a good coverage and good reporting, we're starting to see violations being reported. That first year, from January 2020 through March, we've had over 70,000 violations reported to the clearinghouse. And, from a numerical perspective, there's a little thing we do every year where we kind of call out looking for information so that we can formulate the random drug and alcohol testing rates. It's an MIS survey where we send out mailers to companies, a statistical sample, and then we, from there, basically figure out the positivity rate. And I have to say that, for the last couple of years, we've kind of hovered around about 60+ thousand violations or positive drug tests. And again, that's extrapolated from that statistical sample. But as you can see from what the clearinghouse is telling us, that number is probably really close to being accurate because we've had over 70,000 violations reported to the clearinghouse. Predominantly drug and alcohol, or predominantly drug test violations. But as you can see on the chart, we do have some alcohol violations that are being reported. From a numbers perspective, 81% of the violations reported under controlled substances are for actual drug violations. The other two categories would be refusals, which is the second highest category, and then actual knowledge violations that are reported by an employer. But 81% of the violations reported are for an actual failed controlled substance test. And from what substances that are we seeing? In 2020 for that first year, our top three were marijuana, cocaine, and methamphetamine. And then a close fourth was regular amphetamines. So far in 2021, those top three are actually standing pretty steady. You know, and you know, I put a little asterisk by marijuana because I would think that, you know, a lot of folks out there probably can guess why marijuana is probably the, you know, the #1 substance detected. And it has probably a lot to do with the state legalization of marijuana. The misconception from a driver that, you know, if it's legal in my state, I can, you know, I can use marijuana, but not realizing that on a federal level, marijuana is still illegal. And if you are a CDL driver operating subject to 382, you can't use marijuana even if it's legal in your state. 2 links that I did put up there that are from our Office of Drug and Alcohol Program Compliance that might be good to go to and maybe print out and circulate with your drivers are, you know, just reminders about the issues with state legalization, whether it's for recreational use or medical use, but it is still a prohibited substance in 382 and for testing under our programs. The other big issue that we've run into, and I point out here, is what we've seen with CBD oils, drivers that have taken substances that are, you know, identified as CBD. However, you know, one of the things that we point out, and you can see in that notice, that that is an industry that is not very closely regulated. So while a product may say it does not contain sufficient amounts of the substance that will trigger a positive drug test for marijuana, you can't necessarily believe what's on the bottle. And I can tell you from the number of petitions that we've seen come in, you know, a lot of drivers are indicating that, you know, that's what they're doing. They're either taking a CBD product or using a CBD product in a topical sense, and for some reason, you know, that is triggering the positive for marijuana on a drug test. And, you know, unfortunately, if it is positive for marijuana, even if it's caused by CBD oil, it is still considered a positive. So the driver will not get any dispensation from us from a removal of that test from the clearinghouse. It's just one of those advisories that, you know, you got to be aware of what you're putting into your body and the potential that a CBD product could trigger a positive drug test. From a standpoint of return to duty, you know, I said there was about 70,000 violations reported, and that means there's been about 64, almost 65,000 drivers with at least one violation, and with the understanding that some drivers have had reported multiple violations. So that's where you get that little 70,000 reported and 64,000 drivers. The key number that we're, you know, monitoring very closely are of those 64,000 drivers that have a violation, that are prohibited from engaging in transportation and operating a commercial motor vehicle. How many of those are completing the return to duty process and able to come back on duty? And, you know, since inception through March of 2021, we've had about 10,000, about 10,000 drivers that have completed a return to duty process, including a return to duty test. But that only accounts for about 16% of the drivers that have violations. There's about another 8,600 that have gotten through the return to duty process and would be eligible to come back if they were able to get a return to duty test and have that result entered into the clearinghouse. And when we get to some of our common issues, I'll point out where that, you know, the responsibility of, you know, where that test needs to come from, because that is also a little bit of a confusion out there in the industry. But it isn't something that has changed. Like I said, the program and how we do this has not changed with drug and alcohol. One thing I will point out, though, you know, we've had at least 900 violations reported when a driver did show up for the return to duty test. So here's a driver that had a violation, whether it was a refusal or, you know, failed drug test. They went through the substance abuse program. They got evaluated. They got the clearance letter from the substance abuse professional, and then they showed up to take their return to duty test and failed, which basically then puts them right back to square one when it comes to having to go through the return to duty process. So again, that number speaks for itself. What we are seeing though is initially that number of drivers that have returned was lower. And I think what we're seeing now is the recognition by drivers and employers that, with the clearinghouse in place, there's going to no longer be that ability to fail a drug test and then go somewhere else where they don't know about it and continue to operate. That, we've kind of closed that safety gap that existed, and now drivers are actually, coming to terms with having to deal with getting their problems resolved or their issues taken care of before they can actually come back and operate a commercial motor vehicle. So what are our common issues that we've seen over the last year? And I think hopefully this will answer some of those questions that we've gotten and that we've, that you may have right now. Some of the things with the clearinghouse and registration, incorrect roles. If you're an employer and you've done everything that you needed to do in the clearinghouse and you've registered and you go in there and you can't purchase queries, number one answer back from us is you probably registered as an assistant instead of an administrator. Administrators have, full powers over a clearinghouse account, and they can delegate to an assistant that the assistant can purchase queries. So if as an employer you go in and by mistake register as an assistant, then there's no one to grant you that access. And it's a pretty easy fix if you contact the clearinghouse help team or you contact, I always tell people, contact me and I can get you to the right person to help you get that set up. Obviously anything online can be confusing, but if you run into problems, we can usually take care of it on our end. Another thing we've seen, drivers registering as an employer when they're actually not. I'm not talking about an owner operator who, obviously would have to register as an employer, but drivers just registering mistakenly as an employer and not having the ability in their account to, consent to a query. They would have to add the driver role. They got to make sure they register as drivers in order to have access to those queries that may come in. We've also seen some examples of drivers registering as medical review officers. We had a case of a driver the other day. He registered as a medical review officer and then self-reported that he failed a hair test to the clearinghouse. So effectively, he showed up in the clearinghouse with a violation and being prohibited. And when you went down and looked to see who entered it, he entered it as a medical review officer, and it turned out it was a hair test. That was one we thought we'd never see, but like I said, you'd be surprised at the number of things that are coming to light, or the issues that can happen. So just be on guard for those roles. If you're having struggles or problems in the clearinghouse, double check those roles. Changes to registration information, another thing. Primarily when I went in to register for the clearinghouse in 2019, my safety director, he or she went in, registered our account, was the administrator. But in that time, that person has left the company, and now suddenly we are left without access. Again, since the clearinghouse login is geared to an individual in their email and their phone through login.gov, without their information, you're not going to have access to the account. So if you have a change in personnel and you find that you're no longer able to access the clearinghouse account, get in touch with us. We can help you with that. We can basically, make sure that we can get a person in there, out of there that doesn't belong, and then get somebody in there that should have those rights. And now, if the owner of the company is the administrator, then he or she can go in and make those changes. But like I said, what we've seen is that, some staff within the company have registered and then left, and then the company no longer has access to their clearinghouse account. Another issue we've seen for drivers and even for some employers is the changing of phone numbers, which can happen. You get a new cell phone, you get a new cell phone number, but my cell phone number is tied to my login.gov. When I then go into, register to log into the clearinghouse, it wants to do that second layer of authentication and send a text to a phone I no longer have. Again, these are correctable issues, you know, and usually those can be done through the login.gov interface. One of the easiest remedies is to delete the login.gov account associated with the phone number, wait 24 hours, and then re-register with the same email address, or, you know, and the new phone through login.gov. It will not mess up your clearinghouse account, but it will just basically change what you need to do in login.gov. So these are kind of like the common issues that we've seen. I mentioned this, the two-factor authentication. You have an option, you know, get the text to my phone, but I want to go, I want to just get a list of 10 codes, I believe it is, that you'll type in when it prompts you for those authentication methods. The cautionary tale there, though, is make sure you request new codes before you use up all 10. If you use up all 10, then you won't have the ability to request new codes. And you got to go back in through login.gov and have them help you with that. We kind of always suggest to use the you know, the text message as the phone as your second authenticator. But if you're using the codes, like I said, the caution tip there is make sure you get new codes before you run out of the old codes. Duplicate violations. Early on, this was a bigger problem than we see now. But again, it is something that did come up. And the example being a driver fails a drug test. As that result finds its way through the process, it eventually gets certified by a medical review officer, who then reports that drug result directly into the clearinghouse as a positive. As the employer, you're then sent a copy of that drug test result, and you get that into your possession. And some employers thought, well, I better go in and report this. So they go into the clearinghouse and they see, as an employer, I really don't have the ability to report a positive drug test because you're not supposed to. That's done by the medical review officer, but they felt the need to do it anyway. So they basically said, oh, well, actual knowledge fits. So I'm going to report an actual knowledge violation based off that positive drug test result. What that essentially does is it creates a brand new violation. So the driver will have two violations, a positive drug test and an actual knowledge violation. You know, shouldn't be both. It's one or the other. The only thing that we point out is that if the driver did start the return to duty process based off the positive drug test result, if a week or two later you come in and enter that incorrectly as an actual knowledge violation, the system treats it as a new violation and has the driver restart the return to duty process all over again. If we're made aware of the issue, we can go in and clean that up. But again, just making sure that you know when you have to report something. And the clearinghouse does a really good job of reminding you what you're there to do. So if you're trying to report something and you don't see an option, don't force it. Contact somebody and we can usually walk you through what you're doing or what you should not be doing. So just kind of keep that in mind. And there's a lot of job aids on the Clearinghouse website, you know, really good info with good infographics that walk you through processes. So if you're confused, you can always check there and see what you need to do or what you don't need to do. But that's a good resource. We spend a lot of time on our helpful tools and educational materials. So I would encourage you to take some time to look at them and use them if you need to. Some other issues, validating the CDL license. And again, this is going to occur in two circumstances. The driver's going to go in and try to validate their CDL when they're registering their account, or you're going to validate a CDL when you're in there to run a query. And what happens at times is you get a return that says, you know, this license can't be verified. Early on, a lot of those were issues with how states, you know, unfortunately, you know, you've got 51 jurisdictions and they all have different sequencing for their numbers. There isn't a standard CDL sequencing. So, you know, how states entered it into their systems, how it showed up on the licenses, with spaces, with capital letters. I think there was one state early on that even though there was a letter at the beginning of the license number, if you put that letter in, it wouldn't validate you. So you had to know not to use letter, and nowhere would it tell you that until you try to get in there and validate. We've kind of cleaned up a lot of that stuff on our side, kind of accounting for those state differences. So what we're seeing predominantly now is if your driver has a valid license in their hand and they're having trouble verifying that information in the clearinghouse and they're entering it correctly and nothing is, strange about it, then more than likely it is a issue within the state licensing authority. And I know what I'm going to get is, what we've called the state and they said everything is good. And that is going to happen because the person you're calling to check it with will check it within the state's internal system and it'll show all good. You'll run an MVR, it'll show all good. But there's another step that the states need to do, and that is to enter the information correctly so that it feeds into the CIDLIS or the CDL national database. And that's where things go wrong. So if you have a driver with a verification issue, or they can contact us. It's not a clearinghouse issue, unfortunately, so it's not something we can just go in and fix. But we can reach out to the state of record and determine, let them know when we run it. It'll give us an error message, and we kind of know what the issue is, so we can kind of let the state know what they need to do and go in and fix. And the biggest one is what we refer to as pointers. When drivers switch from one state to another, states are supposed to transfer the driver to the new state. But if they don't, then the new state really can't ever grab that driver's record. And we find a lot of pointers in the system that are not pointed in the right direction. And we just got to contact the state and they have to release it. And then it usually is a pretty easy fix. Not to say we haven't seen some deeper, longer fixes, but those are sort of the oddball ones that we do come across. But most of these can be fixed pretty quickly by the state. So just let us know and we can work with them on that. The other thing I'd point out too is, we mail notifications to drivers based off the address they have on their CDL when they go into DMV and get their license. And I can tell you from the number of returned letters, there are a lot of drivers out there that don't have good mailing addresses on their CDL licenses. So, just a caution there too is, don't assume like the address on their license is where they're going to get their mail, because I can tell you from the return letters we've gotten, there's a lot of CDL drivers out there with bad addresses on their CDL from a mailing perspective. Some other issues, an MRO will, incorrectly report a violation by using a wrong CDL number or no CDL number. And what this can cause is the violation to kind of be kicked out of the clearinghouse to be tracked down separately. So it will get reported and we will accept it. But we have to then come back and, try to track down, what driver this needs to be assigned to. So if you're contacted by the clearinghouse team, on a drug test result that may have occurred because, all we may have on in our possession is the employer that we can go back to. Be aware that, someone may reach out to you just to confirm, who was the person that was that took this drug test. And then once we do that, we'll get it into the system and it'll show up. So if you're looking at, a clearinghouse query and it says a driver took a test on January 1st and it didn't hit the system until, February 1st, then most likely it was reported incorrectly by the medical review officer and it had to get tracked down by us and entered manually. Another topic that has come up and is, I go back to one of those issues where, this has shown a light on the process itself. I think prior to the clearinghouse, refusals occurred in a different fashion in that, what we considered a refusal versus what we didn't, has sort of changed. And now that we're documenting it and tracking it, we're getting a lot of petitions from drivers as it relates to refusals. Now, there's two types of refusals that are reported, and this is important to keep in mind. The first type of refusal that gets reported is by the medical review officer. And that is in the case of a driver with what we refer to as a shy bladder issue, where they go in to give a specimen, they give an insufficient amount, they're given a specific amount of water up to, I think it's 40 milliliters over a 3-hour period. And if they are unable to provide a specimen during that time, they stop with the test, and then the driver has to go for a medical exam to determine why they were unable to give a specimen. And if there is no legitimate medical reason for that, then the MRO reports that to our system as a refused drug test. In those cases, the employer does not have to report anything. That is done by the MRO directly. All other refusals would end up being reported by the employer. And the thing to note here is the employer is the determining factor as to whether or not it is a refusal to test. So if a driver, the ones that we've seen the most are drivers that go for a test. They get told they got to wait for an hour and they have something else to do, let's say, and they decide, I can't wait an hour, I'm leaving. Once they check in for that test and they leave the site, that is considered a refusal. Again, they need to understand that when they go for testing that, and they check in at the counter and they're told they have to go for testing and they check in, they gotta continue with the process. We've had a couple drivers that have, stated they felt uncomfortable or angry with the process and decided to get up and leave. And unfortunately that is considered a refusal, and that should be reported by the employer as a driver leaving a testing site before the sample can be completed. And that's an employer reported refusal. Now, there have been circumstances where, employers have reported refusals incorrectly. Just make sure that if you're reporting a refusal that you document every step of the process. If you notify a driver to go and they take 24 hours to show up at the site, make sure that you can document when you notified the driver to go and then when they showed up at the site. Because if it takes them 24 hours to get there, that is considered a refusal. They need to proceed immediately for testing. And it also falls back on the employer too. Please don't notify a driver to go for a test if you know they can't. Some things that we've seen is, I need you to go for a test, but you need to deliver these 4 loads first. That's not the proper way to do it. The rules basically state that you're for random testing, the driver has to be once notified, they have to proceed immediately for testing. But until they're notified, the employer can basically look for that opportunity to make sure the driver is available and can go. Another issue that we've come across as it relates to the whole reporting of violations, positive refusals, how does a driver return to duty? And you saw some of those numbers earlier that I had posted, specifically the 8,600 that have completed the complete return to duty process, except for that return to duty test. Who does that return to duty test? And it is a great question. Because I think there's a lot of confusion out there as to, who's responsible for giving that driver the return to duty test. And the answer is whoever is going to employ that driver next will be doing the return to duty test. So if if you have a driver that, had a violation and you're bringing them back to work, then you're going to administer a return to duty test. And when that driver tests negative, you're going to go into the clearinghouse and record that the driver received a negative drug test. If you're taking on an employee who had previously had a violation and then comes to you with a SAP, substance abuse professional clearance letter, and they're all good to return to work, and the SAP has entered the information into the clearinghouse that says they are eligible for a return to duty test, then you are going to have to do that return to duty test in order to put them to work for you. Now, the good thing about it is, you have to do a pre-employment test anyway. So you can substitute that pre-employment test with a return to duty test. Just make sure that the driver goes and takes a return to duty test and not a pre-employment. A pre-employment will not count as a return to duty test, but a return to duty test can count as a pre-employment test. And the big difference is when you go for a pre-employment test, it is not an observed collection, but for a return to duty test, it is a required observed collection. That's why you can't substitute a pre-employment for a return to duty. So if you're taking somebody on, you're still only doing one test to bring them on board, but just make sure it's a return to duty test and not a pre-employment test. Now, the rest of the slides, you know, and I think we're going to send them out after the fact, you know, are just some frequently asked questions that we've gotten. These are posted to our website, and they kind of answer some of those things that we've seen from day one as to, you know, what are we doing? You know, the bigger ones, you will only see FMCSA reported drug test results in the clearinghouse. You won't see anything from any of the other modes, FRA, FTA, FAA. This is strictly an FMCSA database. So if a test is mismarked and gets in there, it will come out if it's not an FMCSA test. Do drivers need to register? I kind of said it earlier. It's a great idea to have them to register. I saw one of the questions that talked about the pre-employment queries or a full query, you know, that it takes a long time to get the driver to register and be able to consent. So having drivers registered in advance is a great idea. It speeds the process up. And it's also a way for them to track their information. But if a driver's been with you for 10 years and you have a general consent on file and all you're going to be doing are limited queries, then technically that driver would not have to register unless they decide to switch jobs where, you know, and basically be subject to a full pre-employment query, or if some reason the limited query returns information and you have to run a full query on them, then the driver will need to be registered and they will then need to provide that consent to that full query. You know, as far as registering drivers in the clearinghouse, I said this earlier, it's not a database where you're gonna, you know, store the names of your drivers, but it is where you're gonna go to put that information in. There's nothing wrong with helping a driver to register, but remember the driver's clearinghouse account goes with them when they leave. So I would avoid using a company email address if the driver doesn't have one. You know, help them get a Google or a Yahoo email, but don't use a company email address, because if that driver leaves, then, you know, that email address becomes defunct, then that driver won't have a clearinghouse account anymore. Will employer be notified if a new violation is entered? And again, this is sort of only comes into play off the pre-employment queries. When you run a pre-employment query on a driver, it's a full query, and we will then notify you up to 30 days after that query if new information enters the clearinghouse. And again, this is going to happen. You know, a driver takes 4 pre-employment drug tests, fails the first 3, but passes yours because, you know, of the timing of everything. You know, and then suddenly, you know, everything's clear. You run a query and they're clear, but then suddenly those 3 other drug tests filter in over the course of the next 2 weeks after the MRO certifies them. You will be notified when new information comes into the clearinghouse on those drivers, and you will be prompted to go back in and take a look at that information. With that, I mean, you know, those are, like I said, those are kind of the big questions. You know, one thing that we have been kind of discussing, but that's for a future, you know, a possible change in the future is, you know, the ability to possibly run a limited query as a pre-employment condition. The benefit here, again, would be, you know, you could bring a driver on, you could run your limited query with a written consent on file without having them to go in and register in the clearinghouse to provide consent. You know, and if information did come back that said, yes, there's information available, then obviously you'd have to run the full query. If you kind of keep track of Federal Register notices, you've seen there's been a couple entities out there that have filed for this type of exception or exemption because of the way their businesses are set up. They're looking to run a limited query instead of a full pre-employment query. Again, you don't get the benefit of the 30-day look back, which is a safety gap we got to take into account. But, you know, the longer we get into this, the more things we're looking at to possibly make changes down the line to allow for these certain aspects. So, again, any feedback that you have is always important because we're constantly looking for new feedback from folks as to how we can make the system better or improvements that we can make. And we have a whole laundry list. Some are technical improvements that we're doing. Others are, regulatory fixes that need to be made, which is never a quick process. But, as we identify those needs, then we're absolutely willing to do it. Because if it makes it easier for folks to be in compliance, then we're all for it. So with that, I would just encourage anyone who's not registered, please get registered. Anyone who is, registered, but they haven't run their queries, well, at this point, since we're over a year, every entity would need to have run at least one query, being a limited query on your drivers. At this point, so if you haven't run any queries, then it's always a good time to go in and do it if you need to. With that, I'll turn it back to Cindy and Jeff to see if we have any questions.
All right. Well, thank you, David. Very informative indeed. And there are some questions. One I can pick off right away. You will be receiving copies of the presentation. Not sure if it'll be today or tomorrow, but we'll make sure that everybody gets a copy of the presentation. Couple questions. If anybody does have more questions, please type them into the Q&A and I will get those out to David and he'll try to answer them live here. But I have a couple right here. David, can you explain a knowledge violation in a little greater detail?
Yeah. and this is a great topic that has come up. And again, nothing changed with the clearinghouse as to what an actual knowledge violation is or isn't. But I think like what we saw with ELDs, electronic logging devices, once we instituted that, suddenly there was a big issue with hours of service. What we've seen with the clearinghouse is that, a drug and alcohol testing program that's been around for 20 plus years, once we start tracking stuff, now suddenly there's issues. And there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, we'll tackle them as we come. But actual knowledge has been a tricky one. And by definition, there's specific requirements for an actual knowledge, and it is what it is. A employer has actual knowledge that a driver has had alcohol, had drugs, whether it's direct observation or the one that we've seen the most confusion on is actual knowledge where a driver is cited for a DUI or DWI in a commercial motor vehicle. Okay, that's the most common actual knowledge. I haven't seen too many where an employer has observed a driver, smoking marijuana in front of them. But the actual knowledge that we see the most of is this driver cited for DUI or DWI. Now, the two things to remember, the trigger is a driver is cited, not convicted. It's got nothing to do with conviction. The moment the employer is aware a driver has been cited for a DUI or DWI in a commercial motor vehicle, that is actual knowledge on their part. They would immediately stand that driver down at that point. That driver is prohibited from operating. And then within 3 business days, you would have to report that actual knowledge violation to the clearinghouse. And the driver would have to go through the return to duty test. Now, the biggest question we get is, well, what if 6 months later, the driver's found not guilty? The regulation clearly states that the driver, an actual knowledge violation occurs when the driver's cited. It does not have anything to do with the adjudication. At some point after the fact, if the driver is found not guilty or it's thrown out, they can petition to have that violation removed from the clearinghouse. But the thing they need to understand is that if they want to go back to work prior to that, they have to go through the RTD process because it is based on a driver being cited. Not cited for DUI in an automobile. It's cited for a DUI in a commercial motor vehicle.
Okay. Thank you, David.
Sure.
How about, let's go with this one. So I'm a motor carrier and I use lease drivers on a temporary basis. How do I, as the motor carrier, comply with the clearinghouse regulations?
You're no different than you were complying prior to the clearinghouse. The expectation on any employer is that they are required, they're subject to 382, they're required to, do testing on their drivers. And they're also required to do the, to check these drivers through the clearinghouse as being an employer. Now, one of the things that we put guidance out is that it allows a motor carrier to accept the testing program of another employer. And what we've seen with some these lease companies is that the driver is actually an employee of the lease company. And as such, by definition for 382, they are considered an employer. So they have a drug and alcohol testing program that is doing everything that needs to be done. And as the employer, you have full and unfettered access to that program. You can adopt that program yourself and rely on the, the lease company to provide you with that information if you're ever audited or need it, with the understanding that if they mess up, the violation is going to come back on the employer. If you choose to do this stuff on your own, then you're more than welcome to do it. Some companies will, if I think what I've kind of heard is if it's less than 30 days, we let the leasing company take care of everything. But if we're going to have that driver on our roll for more than 30 days, then we want to take ownership of that driver and be responsible for everything from our perspective.
Gotcha. Thank you. So best practice would be to do your due diligence on your leasing company.
Absolutely.
Sure that they're instituting a DOT FMCSA compliant drug testing program and are running the full and limited queries in the clearinghouse.
Yep. And making sure that as the employer, you have access to all of that program. That's sort of the key component, not just those drivers. If we came in to do an investigation and you said, well, I'm using the random program for XYZ leasing, we'll need to see information on that whole program, not just the little chunk for the drivers that you're using, because there's no way for us to determine who's positive or, testing rates unless we get a look at the whole program.
Thanks. From my perspective, to help with this question, I think that any leasing company, you should ask to see the documents. Yep. And before you use the driver. And any leasing company should be able to show you those documents before you use the driver. I know FLS, we have every document that you need. We can send it over to you before the driver even comes over to drive your truck, and you can view those documents and keep them for your own records.
Yeah, and when it comes to the clearinghouse, and just to remember too, when it comes to the clearinghouse, there's not a lot of time lag. When you go in to run a query, assuming the driver's got, consents, you're going to get that return very quickly within minutes, and it's $1.25. So there's no impediment from a cost perspective to run a full query in a driver other than the driver going into consent. That's the biggest hang up. Beyond that, being able to run that query and turn that around within an hour is more than feasible. So there's no barriers to doing that. If you ever wanted to just double check.
Thank you. The next question, David, how long does an MRO have to post positive drug tests into the clearinghouse? And what are you typically seeing as, report times for those?
So I'd have to double check the reg because I get my 3 days or 1 day mixed up sometimes, but it's either within a day of certifying that result or 3 days of certifying that result. And I don't think they're probably not asking that question. They're probably asking a question because the driver takes a drug test on January 1st, and then the drug test result shows up in the clearinghouse, February 15th. And they're saying, wait a minute, why does it take a month and a half for these things to show up? And there's a couple reasons. I mentioned the whole, we had to do it manually because the MRO messed up. But there are circumstances that could delay an MRO actually certifying a drug test result. Some of the best examples, they can't get in touch with the driver to validate whether there's a medical. The driver requests a split specimen test. The MRO has to reach out to a pharmacy to verify a driver's prescription. And then we've also seen some examples, especially during COVID, where testing has been backed up by COVID testing. So labs that are doing drug and alcohol testing are also doing COVID testing, and the priority was COVID. So drug tests took a little longer. And we've also seen instances where, shipments have been delayed because of, accidents. The FedEx truck got involved in an accident and drug tests, sat on that truck for an extra day or two. So there are a lot of examples. The thing I would kind of key in on is if the MRO certifies a drug test result on a specific day, then that drug test result should be in the clearinghouse. I'm going to say it's within 3 business days. And if it's not, then you should be calling someone to find out why.
Perfect. Thank you.
Yep.
Do you happen to have the percentage of failed tests between pre-employment, random, post-accident, reasonable suspicion, return to duty that are being reported?
I do. I don't, did I have it on that slide? Oh, I control the slide back. Hold on. Can I do that? Thought I might have had it on the slide. 1 second to go backwards. Nah, it's not on the slide deck. But it is in our monthly report that we post. And if I pull it up real quickly, I can probably tell you. And by result. Okay, so the answer to the question, about 88%, this is for 2020, about 88% were pre-employment failures. Just positive refusal. Sorry, hold on. I'm trying to read my own numbers. 88. So predominantly pre-employment failures, and then next was random. And then after that, everything else drops off, way off. So you had about 28,000 pre-employment positives and about 20,000 random positives. So not 88%, but I mean, it was basically 28,000 pre-employment failures and 20,000 random failures. And then the next highest category was, say, post-accident with about 2,100.
Thank you.
Yep.
I think unless anybody has anything else, I think we're out of time, and I think we've gotten most of the questions answered. If there are unanswered questions, I will forward those to David and get some email answers and send them out to the group.
Great. I want to thank you, David, for joining us. That was very interesting, and I'll be interested to hear what you think is going to happen in the coming years with the Drug and Alcohol Clearinghouse, but maybe you can email me your answer and I can get it out. And everybody else, thanks for joining. And we're hoping to be back in one of our nice ballrooms at some point in Lambertville or New Hope for live seminars. But this has been great and very interesting, David.
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity. And before you send out the slides, let me send you the corrected version with the slide that has the actual query information on it. So. Okay,
great.
All right.
So just so folks know, we'll be sending out an email today or tomorrow that has the slide deck and most likely a link to the recorded presentation. And it will also be on our website, and you're welcome to forward it if you have other people in your business that are interested. Thank you.
Thank you.